Hello and welcome to the third episode of the Headlock History podcast. I'm thrilled to be joined by Ben Litherland, author of Wrestling is Britain, Sporting Entertainment, Celebrity and Audiences. It's a brilliant book that explores the cultural, historical and media dimensions of professional wrestling in the UK from the golden days right through to the modern day. And this, of course, made him a perfect fit for this podcast. He's an academic, he's a cultural studies researcher at Manchester Metropolitan University, and he has spent a good chunk of his academic career looking at professional wrestling. He's done his dissertation, his master's, his PhD on that. He's produced books on it. His podcast, Ill Effect, he has episodes about professional wrestling and viewing professional wrestling through these socio-cultural economic lens, which is a really interesting way of looking at things, and I think will help to contextualise some of the stuff we've been looking at in previous episodes about professional wrestling history. Before we bring it to the modern day with the next episode with a wrestler called Critchy, just a short one, followed by the conclusion. I think this will really help bring everything together, really help to clearly let us see those two questions we set out at the beginning, which was why was wrestling taken off of television, taken off of ITV television in 1988, despite its immense popularity in the decades prior, and did the 2010 indie boom constitute a true revival? So, don't want to waste any more time, we'll get right into it with Ben Litherland. So, Ben, if you'd like to introduce yourself and what you do, and what's brought you here today to come on?
Yeah, so I'm an academic who's interested in cultural studies, media studies, cultural history. My PhD was a history of British pro wrestling, and the early parts of my academic career were very focused on pro wrestling. I've moved away from pro wrestling, but as anyone who's ever studied pro wrestling finds, I think pro wrestling stays with you, so I'm interested more in political culture now. But as I think we'll potentially talk about, pro wrestling is there, so I'm interested in like fandom and kayfabe still, and I found it sort of a useful lens to understand not just pro wrestling. So it's still in my work. It's not as explicit as when I was really actually the object of study was pro wrestling, but it never leaves you. I think once you've seen it, you've seen it everywhere.
Absolutely. I mean, like I think it was Kevin Nash made the comment once. Pro wrestling is life, or like life is pro wrestling.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, similar things. Mick Foley's second book, The Real World is faker than pro wrestling.
Yeah,
something to that effect. My memory's terrible, but I think that's a really interesting thing, and I think that's explicit. Like, there's no getting away that the current most powerful man on the planet in the history of the world is in the WWE Hall of Fame and has appeared in pro wrestling. So it's explicit, but it's also implicit as well. I think there's really interesting things that pro wrestling can reveal, I suspect, about kind of modern culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And so before we get on to kind of all that good stuff, what were your first memories of professional wrestling? Did you start as a child like everyone else, or were you?
Yeah. I do know a few people who became pro wrestling fans in their 30s, which is kind of astonishing to me because that isn't how my brain works. No, funnily enough, that the history of my own wrestling fandom is tied up with the history of British wrestling in quite kind of obvious ways. So I've been writing about pro wrestling since I was an undergraduate. So my undergraduate dissertation was about pro wrestling. My master's dissertation was about pro wrestling. And then my PhD was a continuation of the work I'd started at master's level. And I opened with this anecdote in the master's one, which was really, I grew up a WWF fan, which is very significant about sort of my age and my gender and my location. So my dad got Sky Sports in 1992 in order to get what was then the debut Premier League season. So I would have been sort of 5 or 6 at that point. So, reasonably privileged. My dad's a working class man, but, he had a bit of money to spend. And if you had a bit of money to spend as a working class man in 1992, you got Sky Sports. that was like a display and badge of honour. And as a child, I was just struck by it. So I can't remember the very, very kind of first memory, but I have very kind of fond, strong, some of my earliest memories of life really are sitting in front of the television and being sort of struck by these larger than life characters. Bret Hart would have been one of my favourites at that time. The British Bulldog, so again, that history of why WWF ends up at Wembley Stadium in 1992 for SummerSlam is tied up with that sort of economic history. And I was sort of fascinated by that really, that I was a product of these forces that were much, much bigger than me, that the WWF had targeted me as a 5-year-old in Britain. That was the sort of next obvious market. So I open with that anecdote of like my fondness and my own identity is kind of highly constructed around pro wrestling, and that this interaction, I suppose, as a child had kind of, you know, I'm sat here today. I'm genuinely a very lucky man that I'm sat here today getting to talk with your good self about something that I love, that's been with me my whole life. And I was sort of like intrigued by that my nana had loved wrestling as well, but she'd grown up with a very different type of wrestling, and that was the sort of the personal anecdote that then got me into the kind of bigger questions.
And what you're saying there about a very different type of wrestling, I mean, that is particularly interesting as well, because I was WWE by the time I got around to it, but you know, same here. You know, I grew up with that version, that's American sports entertainment. Yeah, Vince McMahon style of professional wrestling was the one I grew up with. Yeah, and the World of Sport era, as we're going to get into, was, and you know, as previous episodes have shown, it was very, very different style. But yeah, before we get onto that, because the crux that has led me to reach out to you was your book, Wrestling in Britain, and it's very, very interesting. I enjoyed reading it and have enjoyed reading it.
Thank you.
No, it was great. I very much did. It was.
You're one of the 20 who's read
it. Well, you know, hopefully one of the 20 who listen to this will go and you know, check it out. But it was a cross section of a lot of my different interests as well. I think that was why I enjoyed it. Sure. I think it's not necessarily common to have a serious study of professional wrestling in that way, but which is also readable and an enjoyable read. You've mentioned about your masters and your dissertation. Was the book a part of that? Because obviously you've got your methodology. It kind of reads almost like an extended, more interesting dissertation, or was that like post your masters, or when did you come to writing that?
Yeah, so this is like a very specific sort of academic type of book, and I was always trying to blend it.
Sure.
Academic books can be really unreadable, and I'm not sure mine is necessarily readable, but I was always kind of conscious that the sort of people who watch wrestling might not necessarily be the sort of people who want to read a kind of super short social history. But in British academia, as academia a lot of the world, you do your PhD, which is an extended kind of research project, really. It's an independent research project. So you say it yourself. I was very, very lucky to be funded for that, which to this day, I feel like I fell through the gaps a little bit of like just this random bloke who's like really loves wrestling, wants to write about wrestling. And I was funded, and there's very little funding these days. So I started my PhD at the start of the 2010s, and I'm potentially the last person to get the sort of funding that I got for the type of project that I was doing. So the book was an edited, redrafted version of what was my PhD thesis, and then it blended aspects of what was my master's work. So it was a continuation, really. So my master's thesis was basically a study of what happened. It was a study of the encroachment of the WWF into Britain specifically and international markets more broadly at the end of the 80s and 90s. My PhD was then a really super long history of like everything that had happened to get to that moment, which is, I think you've got like a similar thing to me of like when you're a big wrestling fan and you take it seriously as a cultural form, an art form, a media form, it's everywhere. It's like it influences everything. I've said for years, I think Vince McMahon was an okay booker, but I think he was legitimately a genius as a media person. Like he was at the forefront of pay-per-view, he was at the forefront of short-form video content online, like long before TikTok. He'd understood that was possibly the future. He understood before Disney did, he was at the forefront of like WWE Network, online stuff. Like he wanted to do his own online television channel in 2004, and the technology was behind him. So he's a piece of shit, by the way. Like I'm not letting him off the hook for it. Like he's a terrible, horrible, morally repugnant human being as a person. But like the WWE's been the most watched thing on cable television in America for like the last 25, 30 years. I can't remember the exact kind of thing. The Rock has been the biggest movie star on the planet for 10 years. Yeah. So I think when you take it seriously, like people don't take it seriously. I think that's the broader point I'm trying to get to.
And they really don't. Yeah,
they really don't.
Correct. I think there's, like there's a snobbery and there's a stereotype about type of people who watch wrestling and what wrestling is, and it doesn't lend itself to serious analysis.
Yeah.
Which is a shame, because as you say and as you've demonstrated, there's quite a lot there.
Yeah.
About to say what about how we view ourselves, how we view our society, and how you can track economic change throughout it. How wrestling has changed broadly parallels how capital's changed as well, I think.
Absolutely, and I think that's probably true of most cultural forms.
Sure.
I think if you go back to like it was one of the most popular entertainments on any TV channel, whether that's in Japan, whether that's in the US, whether that's in Mexico, whether that's in Europe, particularly Britain and Germany. It's always one of the most, if not the most watched thing. Gorgeous George in America in the 1950s was the first television star. And this isn't, sometimes I'm like, this is just because you're a wrestling fan, you're seeing it everywhere. And I'm like, I'm really not. It's really like embedded in contemporary popular culture in really kind of multifaceted ways. And I think that attitude, there is a snobbery. I think it's always been a slightly difficult text to get hold of. I think that's what I was partly trying to do in the book, of like understanding it as both a theatrical form and a sporting form.
Yeah.
And I think you find that certainly in academia, and I think this is true in like newspapers as well, and in journalism footage or coverage of like, well, you don't put it on the back page because it's not a real sport. You don't put it in the business page because it is a business, but like it's not that significant. It's a significant business, but in the grand scheme of things, it's a smaller business. You certainly don't put it on the front page. So where do you do it? And that's a kind of problem of how we categorise and kind of report stuff. You certainly don't put it in like the art section, the theatre review section. So it's always been a little bit like in the middle of stuff, and that being in the middle of stuff like drama studies, theatre studies had a go of analysing it. Media studies has had a go, and there is amazing scholarship now. I think we're at the point now where we can say there is actually quite a rich body of scholarship about it. But it's been a hard time to get there, and I think even today there's a sense of, if you study this thing, you will kind of occasionally get snooty comments, certainly in academia, of like, is there not more important stuff to study? And you're like, well, ultimately this is shaping the world in kind of really explicit ways that we've already spoken about and will continue to speak about. So yeah, it's that was always been the challenge, and that was the kind of pleasure of kind of doing this, of writing a book that particularly in Britain kind of situates it and tries to untangle that mess, because it is a bit of a mess. That's the other thing it is to say. Like, all of these things, I understand why if you were a theatre studies person in 1992, you're like, I could study this, but that's not for me. I'll let the sports people do it, and the sports people are like, it's not for us either. So I get it as well, but yeah.
So we've kind of mentioned about that kind of it's difficult to categorise and that kind of like attitude towards it, particularly historically. Just so we can get a bit of clarity on, just peel it back a little bit. What kind of people historically and today watched wrestling, and how do you think that has impacted its perception? Like, because obviously it was a very working class sport, but beyond that, what kind of people have been attracted to wrestling historically, particularly in Britain?
Yeah, I think class is part of the conversation. It's not as classed as perhaps you'd instinctively think. I do think it probably, predominantly, if you look at the history of it, it was seen as lesser, as most popular sports actually, outside of sort of rugby union. The popular sports were popular because, the vast majority of the country was working class at the time. You can tell a history of class through sort of British wrestling, and you should do. I know sort of my sports historians colleagues, it's not, I'm comfortable being kind of called a sports historian, it's not who I am, but I know my colleagues who are sports historians is the history of class in Britain, the UK, and around the world actually is really significantly tied up with class. And I think wrestling is of course part of that narrative. If you look at its debut sort of in London and Manchester in the 1930s, I suspect, and the mass observers went out and studied this, the vast majority were upper working class, if that's if they were the working classes who had money.
Sure.
Because at that point you needed disposable income, and that's partly what, if you look at 1930s, 40s, 50s popular culture, you're appealing to an emergent working class that do have money to spend, that do want to go out on a Friday and spend their money. So, you're competing with the cinema and the racetrack and all these other spaces. So predominantly, I think it was a working class audience. I think the other key thing for me that's always been fascinating is the gendered audience. So more so than other sports. So throughout the history of any sport, there's always been women audiences, but they've been excluded. They've not been made comfortable in those spaces. Pro wrestling in the 30s very deliberately targeted women. So you look at old footage, there are more women in the audience and in the crowd of a pro wrestling match than there would have been.
Older women as well.
Well, so this is my thing. So the idea, if you look at like joint promotions in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm sorry to clarify.
Yeah.
What about the world of sport era?
So the kind of world of sport, like absolutely the kind of classic Nana at the front row with a drawing pins, doing a knitting, or hitting the wrestlers with a bag. That's almost become like this
stereotype.
My friend has spoken about like it's almost like a figure of the audience, like a synecdoche of like when we think about a wrestling fan in the 60s, we think of like the old granny on the front row. One of the things that I enjoyed in the book was like once you do the longer history, you can kind of sort of make sense of that, is because ultimately in their 20s, when they 30, 40 years earlier, they were targeted. In the sort of the really early era of pro wrestling in the UK, there would have been younger women there, and if you look at the sort of the Path News footage, you can see younger women who obviously then grow out with it. And I think one of the problems that joint promotions found, like joint promotions often tell us, Sky came in and WWF came in and destroyed it. I don't know whether they did enough to appeal to younger audiences. I think the WWF are absolutely to blame for that, but part of an issue that I think they found was that they continued to target like a traditional British working class audience, and that they didn't shift their programming or promotion around that. So that like the cute old Nana on the front row watching the wrestling, and that was my Nana. Like famously, my Nan would get fish and chips on a Saturday and watch the wrestling. The fact that there weren't people in their 20s on the front row in 1978 watching stuff is indicative of a potential wider problem that I think was taking place there. But certainly working class, certainly kind of women. Certainly predominantly white in Britain. If you look at some of the representations, I can understand why you might not go watch the wrestling. There were some quote unquote positive representations and other things, but not unheard of for the National Front to occasionally turn up and support.
Yeah, they had. Was it the Caribbean Sunshine Boys?
It was, yeah.
So
that's those are the sorts of people that would have been going to watch wrestling.
So we're kind of picking up specifically on the fact that women have always appealed to wrestling, particularly as you say. So in the 20s and 30s era, you had a lot of younger women who were interested in wrestling. I think there is people who might hear that who aren't necessarily familiar with wrestling may be relatively surprised by that, because I think when people first think of it, they think of it as a very relatively very masculine, maybe toxically so. Maybe your first thought might be like a Hulk Hogan rather than an Adrian Street. I think so. That might be kind of interesting to hear. What do you kind of make of that in terms of because obviously you have wrestling characters who have flaunted gender roles in that way. You've had an interesting kind of flamboyance always in wrestling. Is wrestling that kind of roided up, because it's both in a way, but
Yeah, I suppose my answer would be it's a typical weasel worded academic answer, which is both. Pro wrestling is big and complicated, and again but it's a cultural expression. It has a lot of scope for lots and lots of different things. I would say I've always been struck, so this is true today, and I think this was probably true 50 years ago, of modern WWE audiences skew more liberal than any other sport in the US, and it skews more not equal. There are more queer people, there are more women who watch contemporary pro wrestling, as there are when compared to other sports. Which I think you're right. I think it does have this impression of being like a deep south and American sort of far right thing, and I'll come back to that point because I don't want to lose that either. But I think if you look at the kind of the longer history of pro wrestling in Britain, certainly when I was researching it, women turned up to watch it. We have some of the things that they enjoyed about the spectacle in the Mass Observation Archives. So the Mass Observation Archives were a incredible resource, like if you're a historian of British social history. So people just went out and studied people in Bolton. It was called Worktown at the time, but it was Bolton, and they just anthropologists and photographers just went out and made notes and asked people, more importantly, write in and tell us what you like about this thing. So we've got like 100 responses about the wrestling, and women liked it for the reasons that probably people like, wrestling today, which was they liked the men's bodies, they liked the silliness of it, they liked the fact that it was dramatic. So it blends dramatic forms that again, this is generalisation, but that women historically have responded well to, things like soap opera and other things. It is camp. It is over the top. You can read it if you're from a particular audience position. It is as much a pastiche of gender roles and masculinity and sport as it is a celebration of those things. It is many things. So I think for the same reasons that you can read it and go, this is real men being, doing real men things. It's also men in like feather boas doing over the top, piss takes of what it is to be a real man. And both those things can be true ultimately, because it depends on who you are as an audience member. But it is a camp, rich, over the top text. I suppose the flip side of this, and I think I personally can go over the top in the celebratory aspects of like, ultimately it is still a genre where like might makes right. Henry Jenkins calls it like a fascist text. Ultimately power is the only thing that kind of results in victory in pro wrestling. So I think you can read it as that as well, and like any popular cultural text, it means different things to different people at different times.
Yeah. Obviously, narratives in sport is across all sport. I mean, that's, hero arcs, and you root for your team, and you follow a player or a sportsman or woman throughout their journey, and we craft narratives around them, I guess, Professional wrestling, though, is unique in that the narrative comes first. That is the whole entire point. It's not a sport first and entertainment second. It is sport entertainment, or if you want to look at another way, entertainment first, So, kind of, what do you make of that? How do you think that may have influenced wrestling's narrative-based form? How do you think that may have influenced other sports as they look to wrestling and how they create those compelling storylines that can always bring people back?
Yeah, I think when I started my PhD, one of my research questions was to understand why wrestling became the sport in which entertainment was institutionalised. That as I was sort of going along, I think the research question changed a little bit actually in my brain to, I think, a more interesting question, or a more provocative version of that question is like, why did no other sports institutionalise entertainment in the same way? Because if you think about it, so, sport for me is one of the most dominant, it's an entertainment form first and foremost, particularly in 2025. I know people do still go and kick a ball around in a park for exercise, but ultimately the money is in the entertainment aspects. And I stumbled across these like little like snippets of alternative histories where somebody tried to do what was happening in wrestling in football in 1905, which was to basically to fix matches and to play them in hyper entertainment formats. And I always like, when I talk to my students about this, I'm like, what a world that would be if that had been successful. And there's no reason to suggest that it shouldn't have been successful. Sure. So I think entertainment has been tied up in sport in really complicated ways for as long as sport has been around, in ways that FIFA don't always openly acknowledge it. But even the sort of earliest boxing fights that we have on film, they do the fight, and then the same two boxers would be forced to kind of perform it for really early black and white silent cinema, which would then be distributed as like the real version of that fight. So that entanglement's always been there, and I think that's one of the reasons why sports people have been so uncomfortable about pro wrestling. It's almost like acknowledging entertainment in sport makes it lesser somehow, and I don't think that has been the case. But from there, I think that influence has been, again, like explicit and implicit. Like Muhammad Ali very, very openly talks about Gorgeous George being an inspiration, and being like, you know, that basically that idea of like playing a heel, playing a bad guy, is where the money is, and that he very deliberately was like, I can talk, and if white America needs a black guy to hate, I'll be the black guy to hate, and I'll be the person who gets paid. Like you're paid to see me get my ass beat, or in the hope that I get my ass beat. And he borrowed just huge amounts from pro wrestling, and he's very open about that. And I think Muhammad Ali's influence from there has played out in, all forms of combat sports since. Obviously boxing, UFC is doing what pro wrestling was trying to do in the 1910s, which is like a hyper entertainment format where you construct storylines and narratives and book those things, but ultimately keep at the heart of it like a quote unquote real fight. I think the way, like it's still, perhaps it doesn't blow my mind as much as it used to, but I used to be like, you'd watch like a Super Sunday and it'd be like, it's just, and with all due respect, you're like, I don't know, Sheffield Wednesday versus Burnley, and it's a shite 0-0 and no one cares. But like they'd have like a promo package before, it's like doom 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 doom. You're like, what is going on here? Of like, it's two mid-division football teams having a sporting match where it's a 0-0 over the course of like a 38-game season that even the biggest fans in the world won't remember this game at the end of it. But Sky Sports have like packaged it and done promos and have sold it in particular ways. I don't think all of that's from pro wrestling, but I think that the sort of the media genre of sport as entertainment has borrowed so much from the way Vince McMahon and other promoters and bookers have thought about it, the way that we tell stories about good and bad. Pro wrestling borrows that from sport, but then sport borrows that from pro wrestling. So it's not possible to say like this is the direct influence.
But it's symbiotic.
It's symbiotic, and I think stuff certainly through the 80s and 90s and noughties where this sort of this mainstreaming of this like entertainment as the dominant value happens. So much of what the WWF was doing at the time, not just in sort of characters, maybe characters is actually the least influence, but in the way that it cuts, the way that it constructs the actual televisual event, the way that you kind of go to the audience member to tell the story. Things that we take for granted if you're watching a football game now, that you cut to a manager's expression or you cut to close-up of audience members, like that had to be developed over the years. If you look at the first ever, sport on ITV, football game on ITV, it's just long camera from the perspective of the spectator. So there's all these like little bits that it doesn't always come from pro wrestling, but I think pro wrestling has been so influential in the way that some of this stuff is constructed.
Yeah, and that kind of leads very nicely on to how professional wrestling and sport was changed by television, which we've discussed quite a bit there, but I'll lead on to a specific point. There's this quote at the beginning of one of your chapters in your book. The quote is, "The introduction of television producers and controllers into the field of sport was the most dramatic restructuring since the genesis of the field in the late 19th century. In turn, this dramatically changed professional wrestling." So, kind of...
Did I write that?
That's
smart,
That's a nice little sentence.
I don't know what the point is, but I'm sure I can extradite.
I think the kind of... The point you're making is about how, or the point I thought you were making at the very least, is how television kind of, it absolutely did. Like joint promotions going on ITV, the camera angles, the commentary, bringing in those sorts of things, it definitely changed things. So if you want to like kind of touch a little bit on that and how the cultural grip that wrestling had over the country during the World of Sport days, I don't think there's necessarily a huge understanding of that amongst younger generations anymore. Everyone knows what WWE is, but I would doubt that everyone knows what World of Sport Wrestling is.
Sure.
So like on that note kind of thing, like how do you think television changed wrestling, and just how popular and how much of a cultural grip did it have?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the point is that television changes everything. Television changes the structure of leisure across the board. I certainly haven't grown up in an era where television isn't the dominant medium / entertainment for everyone. My grandparents, who are in their 80s, don't remember that world. So this isn't just a sport thing, but it really does. Again, mate, I never know whether this is obvious to say, like such an obvious point that it doesn't need saying, but fundamentally, the idea that before really the 1950s, I know there's BBC experiments in the 30s and 40s, but ultimately, if you wanted to watch the wrestling or the football or the rugby or the cricket, that you had to go to a ground, and that was, you know, you paid your money in, and that was the only way to kind of consume it. I would, you know, I don't know the exact tip over the point, but by the 60s, if not before that, you know, in the 50s, the vast majority of people watch these things on television. You know, even in the biggest football stadiums, it's 100,000 people. Television, you can reach the whole nation. By the 60s and 70s, the whole world. And that just, it completely changes the power structures, the way that you organise what it is that you're doing. And that's as true for wrestling as it is for football. So I think the quote that you read out really, you know, if sports established in the 19th century as a public schoolboy thing, and by the 1890s it's becoming professionalised, which is to say you're putting on an entertainment for a paying audience in the ground. By the 1950s, the vast majority of your money is coming from television. And that flow, it just changes the economics of it, it changes the structure of it, it changes everything that you're kind of doing with that. And as you kind of rightly indicate, the television version is a version of what you see in the ground, but it's also very, very different. Just like simple things of being able to cut, I suppose, direct the audience as to what they're supposed to see, the introduction of commentators who become just as famous as the wrestlers themselves. All of these different aspects, it's just huge. It just changes everything. And I think in 2025 we take that for granted. Of course, a football club. So we're filming this in Manchester. A football club like Manchester City or Manchester United, the vast majority of their wealth has been built on selling the version of the football to an international audience who watch it. You know, that's the 60 or 70 or 80 or 90 or, you know, however much it goes up to, barely covering it. It's a tiny fraction of actually where the money is. Vince McMahon immediately understood that. Vince McMahon saw himself as a television producer of which wrestling was his medium. And I think that's important. I think joint promotions I think they saw themselves as a touring pro wrestling entertainment, of which ITV was a shop window for them. So I think over time, again, back to that sort of like what goes wrong, why does joint promotions not kind of last? I know it lasts, but as that sort of dominant entertainment, why does it not last into the sort of like 90s and beyond? Television's part of the question as to what's happening there. But you're absolutely right, like it was huge. I think, you know, if you're not part of that era, just how famous Big Daddy was, Giant Haystacks, Mick McManus, all those names. Again, I don't think this is actually true, but like it was a common belief amongst most people that, you know, the FA Cup final day pro wrestling event, so FA Cup final day, 3:00, broadcast on both BBC One and ITV. You know, I know the FA Cup doesn't have that cultural cachet anymore, but it did. This was like the biggest televisual event of the year. That pro wrestling would follow, and that would be the big joint promotions event of the year, and that ultimately, you know, at the time it was there was a commonly held belief that more people watched the wrestling than they did the FA Cup final. I don't think that's true. I think ultimately what used to happen, in the same way that the World Cup final, it split the audience. So some people watched on BBC, some on ITV. So more people watched the pro wrestling on ITV than they did the FA Cup final. I don't think it's broadly true. But regardless, the fact that could even be a belief,
possible.
Yeah, the fact that could be possible, if you think like 17, 18, 19 million people watching the FA Cup final, and then more people would watch potentially the wrestling event. It's kind of remarkable, particularly when we live in an era where no one, like, if you get 2 million viewers on ITV now, that's like mind blowing.
I mean, wrestling. Yeah, I mean, firstly, television's changed completely. There's that, but then also as well, like I think wrestling now makes it a lot of money from it. I mean, niche is a bit far, but like a very committed fan base who will spend a lot of money to go to events. I mean, like WWE events nowadays. I mean, Jesus, the amount of money you pay to go to them.
Yeah, and that's the dominant logic everywhere.
It is.
We live in such a fractured media environment. So this is an era where there's 2 channels for some of them, up to 3 channels,
it was
and
then
4 channels. So that you might be watching the wrestling because there was nothing else on. I think this is across the media environment now. This is as true for the Premier League as it is for pro wrestling, as it is for boxing, as UFC. You having a committed fan base, and I think WWE has cultivated a really committed fan base. But just how big this was, just like how many viewers week by week Joint Promotions will get, how popular it was. I think William Regal did an interview recently, so there was a bit of a blow up in the 2010s of like British wrestling is back, and there was a bunch of promotions, ICW, Progress, Red Pro, and who are still around doing cool stuff. But there was a real moment in the late 2010s which was very exciting.
Yeah, we have an episode on that. It's a
cool.
big the BritWres boom. Independent wrestling boom. Yeah.
And I think William Regal kind of said he came over to see that, and he was like, "Oh, this is it was cool," but that boom compared to the joint promotions that he was like, we were wrestling sort of 5-6 nights a week. We tour, every market town in the country. We'd be up and down, and we were filling sort of 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people per night. And that just comparison of like the peak of the 70s compared to the peak of the BritWres, God love Progress, and I was there every time, and I travelled to London repeatedly, but it was doing 800 people in a room once a month. And that isn't to say that's bad, it's just like I understand what William Regal's saying of like how popular that wrestling format could have been, or not could have been, was in the 60s and 70s and squeezes into the 80s a little bit is remarkable to get your head around, I think, in an era where like everybody's picking and choosing their own things to watch, and you've got your little anime fans group over there, and you've got your small wrestling fandom, and they're dedicated and passionate, but it's just a very, very different era, and Joint Promotions was at that peak.
So we've touched on this quite a few times, so I'm going to bring it in properly now. So the end of the Joint Promotions era and the end of the World of Sport era, there is as you correctly mentioned earlier, there's a perception that this was brought about by the kind of basically the WWF did it, and I've heard a lot of excuses, to be honest, actually, from various different people. ITV had a snobbish attitude about wrestling, the rise of the WWF in the 80s, and it couldn't compete. But you've also touched upon the fact that the product declined. I mean, it didn't adapt. There's only so many times. I mean, Big Daddy versus Giant Haystacks isn't a technical masterclass. It's not the same as Mick McManus versus Jack Palo. It's not the same. So, and it didn't necessarily mature and change. So I kind of want to touch on that a little bit. On the one hand, I've got the question here is, what can the rise and dominance of WFNE and the failure of post-World of Sport British wrestling tell us about globalisation? And that's one way of looking at it for sure. But another way of looking at it is maybe, why did the World of Sport fail to essentially adapt to the times and change and survive? Well, World of Sport Wrestling.
Yeah, I suppose all of the things that you've just indicated there, there's a case to be made for all of them. Like any failure, everyone involved blames other people or points fingers in different directions. It's really, really difficult to get like a precise answer. And I think ultimately all of those things are probably true. I think joint promotions, the people running joint promotions would say, we just got priced out. And Vince McMahon was an aggressive businessman, always. The exact same things that happened in America, so the death of the territory system, so the way that American pro wrestling had been set up for 30 or 40 years of like, you run a territory, you don't get too greedy, you have a national touring champ, cable television changes everything and national television changes everything, and Vince McMahon takes advantage of that. He's already producing content. He just, goes to these new upstart cable television, Sky, and it was Sky at the time, but satellite broadcasting channels, and says, look, I'm already producing the content. I'll take what we're doing and we'll turn it into a British version. We'll push Davey Boy Smith. You're our next market. Once we've got kind of market dominance in the US, we'll come for you. And there was kind of such claims that he was like charging as little as like £200 per tape, which you're not going to get the ring set up for that sort of money in the UK. And if you're an upstart satellite broadcaster like Sky at the time, you don't have a huge subscriber base. You've got money to spend. You're not spending your money on pro wrestling. We found since that actually you can spend a lot of money on pro wrestling. Netflix has just spent $5 billion on it, so there is a market. But at the time, the prevailing logic was movies and football. That was the Rupert Murdoch plan, and it worked. So rightly or wrongly, Premier League football and Hollywood movies were what people were putting their money down, and at that point you just need filler content. So I do think the economics of this do need to be laid out. Like I don't want to talk that down. Maybe even if joint promotions had stayed bang up to date, it would have been a difficult proposition. I think the way broadcasting changes, ITV did have this in the mid 80s, it did have this slightly identity of being like the working class channel for working class entertainment. And I think in the 80s they were starting to shift again, in part because they're trying to sell to advertisers, and advertisers want aspirational stuff. So the new working classes that Thatcher was trying to, or did, kind of produce and develop, ITV just went with them, and the idea of come sell your entertainments to us. We've got 50 and 60-year-old women who are proper traditional working class. The money isn't there anymore. So ITV again makes a decision that it's not going forward with sort of joint promotions. But I do think joint promotions itself, the people who were booking joint promotions in the 70s and 80s, the people who were kind of running British professional wrestling, were more or less the same people who've been running professional wrestling in the 40s and 50s. They still have a very traditional idea of what pro wrestling should look like, which is you present it as a sport, you tell everyone it's real. I don't think audiences ever believe that. That's a bee in a bonnet that I have. That audiences never thought it was real. Like, they always knew. Of course they knew it wasn't real. But they were kind of, you pitch it as a traditional sport. You shoot it in long camera, and then two cameras in the side of the ring. It felt very old fashioned. I think I maybe make this point in the book, or certainly I did in other bits of writing, of like, can you imagine being a 20-year-old in like 1988 and you put on ITV, and it must have felt ancient, of like the old grannies are in the audience, you've got the British, it's live from Reading Town Hall, and like, come on. And then you flip over onto Sky and it's like fireworks and explosions and full stadiums and swish graphics, and this just like 2-minute matches and big characters, and you've got Macho Man Randy Savage, who is on steroids obviously, but is huge and suntanned and beautiful, and like cutting these promos, and then you turn back and it's like a 55-year-old fat white man from Burnley or what. It would have felt very, very different. And I think joint promotions it didn't invest its money. It didn't attempt in any meaningful way to kind of push new characters that maybe would have stayed in Britain. I think it's quite telling that Davey Boy Smith ends up in America with a tan on steroids, but looks, he is a Burnley lad, or wherever, Wigan lad, sorry, Greater Manchester, but it's very telling to me that these wrestlers end up going over to Canada and the US and get folded into the WWF machine, and that Davey Boy Smith is then sold back to a British audience, and it just feels fresher. So I don't know whether joint promotions could have done anything to fight that off. Possibly not. The WWF have put better promotions out of business. They certainly didn't do much to fight it off, though. I suppose that balance of there is a huge structural aspect to this, but they didn't seem particularly well equipped for the fight.
Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, that was really interesting discussion. Before we kind of finish up, I just want to get a couple of more light-hearted ones. Just kind of discussions about, we mentioned that you grew up with the WWF.
Yeah.
Who was your wrestler? Who was your guy?
Oh.
I'm a CM Punk kid. That was always my and actually when I was a lot younger, John Cena. That was my.
Okay.
I was a Cena kid and then a Punk preteen, I guess.
I'm the same. You can kind of pick moments in my life. Like I was a big Bret Hart guy, and then my shift was I became like a Shawn Michaels, and then obviously like Austin and The Rock. So I think Shawn Michaels is probably my favourite of all time. That era is my era.
New generation, going into that.
Yeah, I'm very much new generation. But then, I swear that like my mum was like, "It'll grow out of it one day," and I didn't. So I continue to be a wrestling fan. I'm still fascinated by it.
Yeah,
CM Punk is a current fave for many reasons. So we're recording this in the wake of. Cena's just turned heel. I don't know when this will be going public or when people will be listening, but this is still very fresh in my brain in the recording studio of like, I don't think you can get that moment in any other mode of storytelling.
No, you definitely can't.
Where just like, so I went to WrestleMania 20, so that was my first ever. I'd saved up. I was 18. My mum was like, "All right, you're allowed to go. I'm not paying anything," but I saved up my pennies. WrestleMania was a lot cheaper then, and I travelled to New York, and it's quite a kind of big moment in my life, like the first time I travelled alone. But that was not CM Punk, John Cena's first WrestleMania, and he was like huge babyface, and I loved him at the time. And I'm like, I'm approaching 40 years old, and my entire adult life from 18 to I'm 39 now has been. John Cena's ruined some WrestleManias for me when I've been drunk with my mates. Like really desperately wanted him to lose. He's been part of like exciting moments. He's just been this presence, this like omnipresence in my life, and to have him become a bad guy is such a remarkable thing. And I wish sometimes I wish I could explain to non-wrestling fans that the
absolutely
like the emotional sort of resonance of watching somebody on TV for
21 years.
For 21 years, like give me another art form or form of storytelling where you can have that moment of like I don't know where everything comes to pass. Wrestling is terrible a lot of the time.
Yeah, that's true as well.
There's huge moments of like boredom, but just that moment of like.
But it's all worth it, though.
It's all worth it in those moments, and it's given me so many moments like that in my life.
So, before we finish up, just wonder if you want to talk at all, because you have your own podcast.
Yeah, I'll do a cheap plug.
Absolutely.
I'll do a cheap plug. There's a wrestling episode on that, so if you've enjoyed me chatting about wrestling, particularly the stuff about politics, so I do a longer history of how I think pro wrestling helps us understand the conservative movement through the lens of the idea that pro wrestling causes kids to try this at home. So there's that episode, but the podcast itself is about media influence, media effects, moral panics, trying to debunk or kind of dig into claims that video games make us violent or horror movies turn us into serial killers. So that's called Ill Effects. You can find that anywhere you find podcasts, so Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc. That's it.
Yeah, so the Ill Effects podcast on Spotify, Benjamin Liverland. Thank you very, very much. I really, really enjoyed the chat.
Yeah, loved it. Cheers, pal.
Alright, that was Ben Litherland on the Headlock History podcast, and we covered a hell of a lot there. Kind of a cursory glance at a lot of different things which Ben explores in his book and others as well. I'm not going to really delve and connect all the different things across the different episodes yet. I'm going to wait until the conclusion for that, where Ben's analysis is very much going to be coming back, along with a few other pieces of literature, such as David Boyd's PhD as well, more recent PhD, and a couple of other things as well, where we could try and again tackle those questions about, was the 2010s resurgence a true revival? Why was wrestling cancelled off of ITV in 1988? And this all, I mean, to say the least, really helps answering in those questions, and just really, really great to have Ben on. He's a really interesting guy, really intelligent guy, a lot of very interesting views about wrestling and the world, and kind of placing wrestling in that broader context. So, yeah, I've not really got much more to say than that. We're going to return to a lot of this analysis in the conclusion, which is why I don't want to give too much away now. But before we can get that conclusion, we're going to have a pit stop in the next episode with Jack Critchlow, aka Critchy, who is a professional wrestler in Britain, and we're going to get that kind of more, I guess, less academic, maybe more grounded on the ground from an in-ring wrestler. Another point of view to add to the collection before we conclude and kind of wrap all this up and bring it all together. So yeah, thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next Headlock History with Critchy.